Hey, this is Bunny. Today, while we paint, we're wandering into one of my favorite parts of fantasy storytelling morality. Not morality in a tiny little storybook sense where the hero wears white, the villain wears black, and everyone conveniently announces their alignment before combat. I mean the messy stuff. The decisions where every option has consequences. Good people make terrible choices. Terrible people occasionally do something decent. And your Dungeons and Dragons party spends 45 minutes debating whether stealing from a corrupt noble technically counts as theft. Fantasy gives us enormous freedom to explore good and evil, but some of its most interesting stories happen when we stop treating morality like two clearly labeled buckets and start asking what those words actually mean. Now, good and evil absolutely have their place in fantasy. Sometimes you want an evil necromancer raising an army of corpses because he's an evil necromancer raising an army of corpses. We don't necessarily need to discover that his mother failed to hug him sufficiently when he was 7. Sometimes the Dark Lord is simply the Dark Lord. The villagers are screaming, the castle is on fire, and somebody needs to locate the nearest enchanted sword. Straightforward villains can be incredibly fun. Straightforward heroes can be fun too. There is something deeply satisfying about watching someone stand against an obvious evil because it's just the right thing to do. Moral complexity does not automatically make a story smarter. Sometimes it merely makes everybody exhausting. But fantasy becomes particularly fascinating when the questions get harder. Imagine a ruler who genuinely wants to help protect their people. They have seen famine, war, disease, and chaos. They know exactly how quick society can collapse, so they begin imposing stricter laws. Travel is restricted, resources are controlled, dissent is suppressed because dissent might create instability. Eventually, people are safe, fed, housed, and completely unable to determine the course of their own lives. Is that ruler evil? Maybe. But perhaps they do not wake every morning, dramatically swirl their cloak, and whisper, "Excellent, another glorious day of oppression." Perhaps they honestly believe freedom is a luxury their people cannot afford. Suddenly, the moral question is not good versus evil, it's safety versus autonomy. That kind of conflict works beautifully in tabletop gaming because the players have to participate in it. A novel can show us a character wrestling with an impossible choice, but a role-playing game looks across the table and says, "Fantastic. Now you decide." Your party arrives in a village threatened by monsters. The local lord has protected the villagers, but his soldiers confiscate food and force everyone to obey harsh curfews. The villagers hate him, but without his soldiers, they might genuinely die. Congratulations, adventurers. Here's your quest. Please resolve centuries of philosophical disagreement before the pizza gets cold. And somebody at the table will still suggest killing the Lord within approximately 14 seconds because apparently political philosophy becomes that much easier once initiative has been rolled. Older versions of D&D leaned heavily on alignment as a way of describing morality and worldview. Lawful good, chaotic good, neutral evil, and all the familiar combinations gave players a quick framework for understanding characters and creatures. Alignment can still be useful as shorthand. If someone tells me their paladin is lawful good, I immediately have a rough idea of how that character probably approaches duty, rules, and compassion. But alignment becomes less useful when we treat it like a cage. A lawful good character can make a terrible decision. A chaotic neutral character can risk everything to save someone. A villain can love their children. A hero can be petty, selfish, jealous, frightened, vindictive, or spectacularly bad at choosing when to shut up. Because morality is not the same thing as personality. This distinction matters enormously when creating memorable fantasy characters. Being good does not mean being pleasant. Your heroic cleric might be brave, compassionate, generous, and so irritating that the party occasionally considers feeding him to an owlbear. Your villain might be charming, funny, polite, and genuinely delightful company right up until somebody mentions the horrifying empire they are constructing. We sometimes unconsciously associate kindness of manner with moral goodness, because that's how stories often signal who we should trust. Fantasy becomes more interesting when those signals are unreliable. The grumpy old woman living alone in the swamp might save your life. The dazzling prince with impeccable manners might be the reason everyone needs saving in the first place. Motivation also complicates morality because people rarely describe themselves as evil. A tyrant might believe they are preserving civilization. A cultist might genuinely believe their terrifying deity will save the world. A revolutionary might believe innocent casualties are an unfortunate but necessary cost of overthrowing oppression. A knight might commit atrocities because they have been taught since childhood. that obedience is virtue. None of this excuses what they do. Understanding why someone behaves terribly is not the same thing as declaring their behavior acceptable. Explanation is not absolution. Sometimes understanding a villain actually makes their actions more disturbing because we can see the perfectly ordinary chain of reasoning that carried them somewhere monstrous. This gives us a useful way to build villains while we are sitting here painting tiny people who may or may not be planning several felonies. Instead of beginning with, "What evil does my villain want?" try asking, "What does my villain believe is worth sacrificing?" Almost everybody has something they value: peace, family, power, knowledge, order, freedom. The interesting part is discovering what they are willing to destroy in pursuit of it. A villain who values order might sacrifice freedom. One who values knowledge might sacrifice lives. Someone obsessed with protecting their family might happily burn down everyone else's family to accomplish it. Morality often becomes visible not through what characters value, but through what they decide does not matter enough. Heroes work the same way. We tend to define heroes by what they fight for, but what they refuse to sacrifice can tell us just as much about them. Suppose two characters both want to overthrow a brutal king. One refuses to harm civilians, even if it makes victory harder. The other believes civilian casualties are unavoidable and argues that ending the king's reign will ultimately save more people. They share the same goal. They might even fight beside each other. But morally, they are standing on very different ground. That difference creates fantastic tension because neither character needs to twirl a mustache. They can respect one another, care about one another, and still reach a point where one says, "I can't follow you any further." And that's where consequences become essential. Moral complexity does not mean that every decision is equally defensible. If a character burns down a village to stop an invading army, the story should not shrug and say, "Well, morality is complicated." Yeah, morality is complicated. The village is also still on fire. People have lost their homes, families may have died, survivors might hate the person responsible even if the decision saved thousands somewhere else. A compelling, morally complicated story allows multiple truths to exist at once. The decision may have prevented something worse. It may also have caused tremendous suffering. The character might have made the best choice available and still carry responsibility for what happened. Sometimes there's no magical moral dishwasher setting that gets everyone sparkling clean afterward. This is especially powerful in campaigns because consequences can follow the players. The bandits they spared might return later as allies. Or they might rob another caravan and now the party has to live with that. The corrupt official they exposed might have been the only person keeping a fragile bureaucracy functioning, and suddenly the city is collapsing into chaos. The monster they killed might have been protecting its territory from something much worse. None of these twists should exist purely to punish players for making choices. If every merciful decision produces catastrophe, your campaign has not become morally sophisticated. You've simply trained your players to stab everything before it develops a backstory. Consequences should deepen decisions, not turn compassion into a mechanical error. The same applies in reverse. Cruelty should not automatically become wisdom simply because the setting is dark. Grim fantasy sometimes falls into the trap of assuming that the harshest person in the room must also be the smartest. Somebody says, "We have to abandon the wounded," while staring dramatically into the rain, and suddenly everybody acts as though this person has earned a doctorate in practical reality. Maybe abandoning the wounded is necessary. Maybe it's cowardice dressed up as pragmatism. Maybe there's another solution nobody considered because Sir Grimdark McLeatherpants desperately wanted another opportunity to explain that hope is for children. Darkness can create moral complexity, but cynicism by itself is not complexity. Sometimes cynicism is just pessimism wearing expensive armor. Likewise, compassion should not require stupidity. A morally good character can understand risk. They can recognize that someone is dangerous and still believe that that person deserves humane treatment. They can forgive without trusting. They can show mercy without handing the villain their sword, or their house keys, or their banking information, or directions to the sacred artifact. I love characters who are compassionate with their eyes open. They understand exactly what cruelty would accomplish and deliberately choose another path. That can require far more courage than simply destroying an enemy. Of course, sometimes your D&D party interprets show mercy as tie the goblin to a chair and conduct a 4-hour group therapy session, but nobody said adventurers were trained mental health professionals. In fact, based on most character backstories, quite the opposite. Fantasy also lets us separate legality from morality. This is where lawful characters can become incredibly interesting. A law can be unjust. Breaking that law can be morally defensible. Following a law can cause harm. But laws can also protect people, create stability, and prevent whoever owns the largest axe from becoming the unofficial mayor. A lawful character does not necessarily have to obey every written rule. They might instead believe deeply in institutions, promises, traditions, codes, or responsibilities. Their conflict begins when those structures stop preserving the principles they were meant to protect. What does a devoted knight do when the crown becomes corrupt? What does a paladin do when duty demands something conscience rejects? This is much more interesting than simply checking whether the rulebook permits smiting. Chaotic characters deserve the same nuance because chaotic does not mean I set the tavern on fire because I got bored. That's not a moral philosophy. That's why the party is no longer welcome in Waterdeep. A character who values individual freedom might distrust authority because they have seen institutions become abusive. They might believe people should be allowed to make their own choices even when those choices are foolish. But then comes the difficult question. What happens when one person's freedom threatens somebody else's? Absolute freedom sounds wonderful until your neighbor decides their personal liberty includes keeping a pet wyvern on an unsecured balcony. Suddenly, regulation begins to have a certain charm. And then we arrive at one of the oldest moral problems in fantasy. Does the end justify the means? Villains absolutely adore this question. Give a fantasy villain 5 uninterrupted minutes and they will explain that everything horrible they have done was necessary for the greater good. There will probably be a map involved, possibly a chart. Heroes encounter the same temptation. If torturing one prisoner could save a city, would they do it? If sacrificing one person could seal a portal and save thousands, should they? Fantasy can exaggerate these dilemmas until they become enormous and dramatic, but the underlying question remains painfully recognizable. How much harm are we permitted to cause in pursuit of something we believe is good? The danger comes when certainty enters the equation. Characters become frightening when they stop questioning whether their cause justifies their behavior. A person who knows they might be wrong has reasons to hesitate, listen, compromise, or reconsider. Someone utterly convinced of their own righteousness can justify almost anything. That applies to villains, heroes, kingdoms, rebellions, adventuring parties, and unfortunately, Kevin the Paladin, who has once again decided that every locked door is probably concealing evil. Certainty can become its own kind of corruption, not because strong convictions are inherently dangerous, but because believing yourself incapable of moral error removes one of the most important restraints on your actions, the possibility that you should stop. This is why some of the best fantasy conflicts happen between people who genuinely believe they're doing the right thing. Not because truth doesn't exist, and not because every perspective deserves equal moral weight, but because human beings can share values and still disagree profoundly about how those values should be applied. Two characters can both care about justice while disagreeing about punishment. Both can value peace while disagreeing about whether peace is worth surrender. Both can love their kingdom while disagreeing about what that kingdom should become. The conflict becomes richer because defeating the other person does not automatically answer the question. You can win the battle and still wonder whether you were right. And that uncertainty is exactly where fantasy morality starts becoming really interesting. We can populate our world with gods, demons, dragons, cursed swords, and suspiciously articulate mushrooms, but eventually the most difficult monsters might be the choices our characters have to make. Good and evil can still exist. Some actions really are cruel. Some causes really are unjust. Some villains do not need rehabilitation, a tragic violin soundtrack, or 6 episodes explaining their childhood. But between obvious heroism and obvious evil lies an enormous landscape of competing duties, flawed decisions, unintended consequences, and people trying to decide what they owe one another. So who actually gets to decide what good means? Fantasy worlds frequently have an answer: the gods. That seems wonderfully convenient. If actual divine beings occasionally descend from the heavens, hand out miracles, and smite people with enough lightning to make their opinions reasonably clear, surely morality becomes simple. Except it doesn't. Gods can disagree. Gods can have competing values. Gods can demand obedience without necessarily deserving it. Even when a deity is truly benevolent, mortal followers still have to interpret what that deity wants. Apparently not even divine intervention can save civilization from committee meetings. The moment people begin interpreting commandments, traditions, visions, prophecies, and sacred texts, morality becomes tangled in culture, power, history, and the deeply moral tendency to hear exactly what we hoped the universe was going to say. That can create wonderful conflicts for clerics and paladins because faith does not have to eliminate moral uncertainty. It can actually intensify it. Imagine a cleric devoted to a god of justice who discovers that their church has become corrupt. Their faith remains intact, but their trust in the institution representing that faith collapses. Do they obey the hierarchy, rebel against it, leave, stay and try to reform it? Suddenly, the character is not choosing between faith and unbelief. They are deciding what genuine devotion requires. A paladin might face something similar when two parts of their oath collide. Protect the innocent, uphold justice, honor legitimate authority. Wonderful. Now the legitimate king has ordered something unjust that will harm innocent people. Congratulations, your beautifully polished oath has become a philosophical bear trap. Culture complicates morality in much the same way. Different societies can sincerely value different things without every difference being morally equivalent. One kingdom might emphasize individual freedom, while another emphasizes responsibility to family and community. One culture might consider refusing hospitality disgraceful, while another places enormous importance on privacy and personal boundaries. These differences make fantasy societies feel real because morality is not floating above culture untouched by it. People learn what obligations they have from the communities around them. But cultural context should explain behavior rather than automatically excuse it. That is our tradition can tell us why someone believes something. It can't magically transform cruelty into kindness. Otherwise, every fantasy tyrant would simply hire a historian and become morally untouchable. When creating fictional cultures, moral complexity should not become an excuse for lazy world building. If a society practices something harmful, ask who benefits from that practice, who suffers from it, who questions it, and how it became normalized. Real cultures are full of disagreement. Fantasy cultures should be too. Elves do not all share one personality because they have pointy ears. Dwarves, presumably, have political arguments. Orcs have families, communities, disagreements, traditions, and at least one uncle who arrives at every gathering prepared to explain why young orcs are ruining everything. A believable society contains conservatives, reformers, opportunists, idealists, cynics, rebels, and people who would really prefer everyone stop debating politics because dinner's getting cold. And then there's the question fantasy has historically loved making suspiciously easy. What happens when an entire species is labeled evil? For gaming purposes, having obvious enemies can be convenient. Adventurers enter dungeon, monsters attack, dice begin making betrayal noises. Simple, but modern fantasy increasingly asks what it means to declare an intelligent people inherently wicked. If creatures can reason, form relationships, raise children, create communities, make choices, and disagree with one another, then treating morality as biological destiny becomes difficult to defend. Individual creatures can absolutely be monstrous. Entire organizations can be monstrous. Cultures can normalize horrifying behavior. But once a being possesses meaningful moral agency, their choices become more interesting than a label printed beside their species name. And frankly, that gives us better characters. The orc who rejects the expectations of their clan is interesting. So is the orc who loves their clan but wants to change it. So is the goblin merchant who has absolutely no interest in heroism because she has 3 children, 17 customers, and an inventory problem involving several crates of mysteriously glowing turnips. Not every member of your traditionally villainous fantasy species needs to become secretly wonderful either. That would merely replace one stereotype with another. Let them be people. Some generous, some cruel, some brave, some cowardly, some heroic, some awful. Some so profoundly ordinary that their greatest moral crisis this week involves whether they should admit they accidentally broke their neighbor's wheelbarrow. Morality becomes particularly interesting when survival enters the picture. It's easy to behave according to our principles when those principles cost us nothing. Fantasy frequently removes that comfort. A starving village discovers food belonging to another starving village. Refugees arrive at a city whose supplies are already dangerously low. A besieged fortress has medicine for 20 people and 50 people who need it. Suddenly, compassion has arithmetic attached, and nobody likes the equation. Characters may make decisions they would never have considered under ordinary circumstances. That doesn't necessarily make every choice acceptable, but desperation changes the moral landscape because options disappear. Sometimes the most meaningful thing a story can show us is not whether someone remained perfectly virtuous, but what parts of themselves they fought hardest to preserve. War magnifies the problem enormously. Fantasy loves war because wars provide battles and banners and cavalry charges and siege engines and dramatic speeches and excellent excuses to own far too many miniature soldiers. But war also creates situations where ordinary moral rules become horribly strained. A commander might need to choose between defending one town and another. Soldiers may follow orders they believe are wrong because disobedience could endanger their companions. Rebels might sabotage infrastructure knowing civilians will suffer. Rulers might continue fighting because surrender would protect lives today while creating oppression for generations. If we treat wars simply as heroes fighting villains, we lose an enormous opportunity to explore what prolonged violence does to people's understanding of duty, loyalty, sacrifice, and responsibility. Loyalty itself is one of fantasy's most beloved virtues, and it can become terrifying when taken too far. We admire the companion who refuses to abandon a friend. We admire soldiers who stand beside one another. We admire families who protect their own. But what happens when the person you love does something unforgivable? When does loyalty become complicity? If your closest friend commits a terrible crime, does protecting them make you loyal or cowardly? If your ruler becomes cruel, does your oath still bind you? If your adventuring companion starts collecting suspicious magical artifacts and muttering about how nobody truly understands their destiny, perhaps friendship now requires taking away the glowing skull rather than enthusiastically helping them locate the remaining 6. That's why betrayal can sometimes be morally courageous. Fantasy often treats betrayal as automatically dishonorable, but context matters. Betraying someone for money is rather different than betraying a tyrant to save their victims. Breaking an oath can be selfish, or can represent the moment someone realizes that oath has become immoral. A knight who swore lifelong service to a king might eventually decide that protecting the kingdom requires opposing the king. Now that decision should still hurt. If promises mean nothing, breaking them carries no moral weight. A powerful story allows a character to recognize that violating their oath might be necessary, while still mourning what that violation says about the world they once believed in. Redemption introduces another wonderfully messy question. Does everyone deserve another chance? Fantasy loves redemption arcs, and for good reason. Watching someone recognize the harm they have caused and genuinely change can be incredibly satisfying. But redemption is not the same thing as forgiveness, and neither automatically produces reconciliation. A former villain might become a better person without their victims ever welcoming them back. Someone can regret what they did and still face consequences. In fact, accepting those consequences should be a part of redemption. I have changed, therefore everyone I harmed must immediately stop being angry is not redemption. That's customer service for villains, and the return policy has become wildly unreasonable. Forgiveness belongs to the person who was harmed. Redemption belongs to the person trying to change. Those two journeys may intersect, but they don't have to. That gives fantasy stories room for far more emotionally believable outcomes. Perhaps the disgraced knight spends the rest of her life protecting people and never receives forgiveness from the people she once betrayed. Her good actions still matter. Her past also still matters. Both things can remain true. Moral growth does not require the universe to erase the receipt. Sometimes becoming better means accepting that you cannot repair everything you broke and choosing to do better anyway. That is considerably harder than completing 3 heroic quests and expecting the morality scoreboard to reset to 0. Of course, tabletop players are astonishingly unpredictable about redemption. A carefully constructed villain might deliver a heartbreaking confession, reveal years of regret, offer to surrender, and ask for one chance to make things right. Half the party will be emotionally devastated. Rogue will ask whether the villain's boots are magical. Meanwhile, some completely incidental goblin named Steve, who appeared for 30 seconds, will receive unconditional love, a bedroom at party headquarters, and possibly partial ownership of the adventuring company. Dungeon masters can't control this. We merely observe it, like wildlife researchers documenting the baffling migration patterns of emotionally compromised dice goblins. This is another reason moral choices work so beautifully in tabletop games. Players decide who matters to them, often with absolutely no regard for our carefully prepared notes. Mercy becomes especially meaningful when it carries risk. Sparing an enemy who cannot possibly hurt you is kind. Sparing someone who might genuinely betray you requires something more complicated. But mercy doesn't have to mean being naive. Characters can offer someone a chance while establishing boundaries. They can believe people are capable of change without pretending change has already happened. They can release an enemy from vengeance without releasing them from accountability. Fantasy sometimes frames mercy and justice as opposites, but they can coexist. Justice asks what responsibility requires. Mercy asks whether responsibility must always demand the maximum possible suffering. Somewhere between those questions sits a very interesting paladin, probably rubbing their temples while the barbarian repeatedly asks whether they are allowed to hit anybody yet. Perhaps the most important thing about morally complicated fantasy is that characters should still make choices. If every question ends with, well, everything is subjective, so who can really say, then moral complexity becomes moral fog. Interesting ambiguity does not mean refusing to judge anything. Characters can examine competing values, recognize uncertainty, understand opposing perspectives, and still decide that something is wrong. In fact, decisions become more meaningful when they are made after understanding the complexity rather than before it. A hero who opposes a tyrant because the tyrant has evil written on their character sheet is functional. A hero who understands exactly why that ruler became oppressive, sympathizes with their fears, and still says, "No, this cannot continue," is compelling. That matters when we are creating our own characters, campaigns, and stories. We do not need to begin by assigning everyone a philosophical thesis. Start smaller. Ask whether your character believes they owe other people. Ask what they would never do. Then ask what might make them reconsider. What does your paladin value more than obedience? What could make your rogue return stolen money? Who would your barbarian refuse to fight? What would your wizard destroy knowledge to protect? Those questions create moral boundaries, and boundaries give us something meaningful to test. The interesting moment comes when circumstances push against them. Suddenly, the miniature we spent 3 hours highlighting is not merely a collection of tiny belt buckles. It represents somebody who has to choose. And choices are where morality becomes visible. Characters can describe themselves however they like. They can claim to value justice, compassion, loyalty, honor, freedom, the sacred principle of never paying full price for healing potions. Eventually, something will cost them. And that is when we discover what they actually believe. The compassionate character must decide whether compassion extends to an enemy. The honorable knight must decide whether truth is worth personal disgrace. The freedom-loving rogue must decide whether their freedom matters more than someone else's safety. Values become meaningful when keeping them requires sacrifice. Otherwise, they're simply attractive words embroidered onto a cloak. And that's why failure belongs in moral storytelling. Good characters should sometimes fail their own standards. They should become frightened, angry, selfish, exhausted, or convinced that this one exception will not matter. Then they have to live with what they did. That doesn't automatically transform them into villains. In many cases, remorse and accountability reveal more about someone's morality than flawless behavior ever could. A character who never faces temptation is difficult to evaluate. A character who fails, recognizes the harm, apologizes without demanding forgiveness, repairs what they can, and changes their behavior has actually demonstrated something. Apparently, moral development works rather like miniature painting. Occasionally, you make a spectacular mess, stare at it in horror, and discover whether you are willing to do the painstaking work of fixing it. Ultimately, moving beyond simple good and evil does not require abandoning good and evil altogether. Fantasy can still contain genuine cruelty, genuine courage, injustice worth fighting, and kindness worth protecting. Moral complexity simply allows us to examine the roads people travel to reach those places. It asks why good people fail, why harmful people believe themselves righteous, and why decent values can collide, and why doing the right thing sometimes leaves scars anyway. It gives our heroes convictions instead of halos, and our villains motivations instead of mandatory mustaches. But importantly, it gives everyone choices. Because once characters are free to choose, morality stops being something printed on a character sheet and becomes something revealed through the lives they lead. And maybe that's why fantasy is such a wonderful place to explore these questions. We can put impossible moral problems at a comfortable distance. We can examine power through kings and sorcerers, prejudice through imaginary people, responsibility through adventurers, corruption through magical institutions, and sacrifice through choices involving dragons instead of our next-door neighbors. Then, somewhere between rolling dice and painting tiny swords, we occasionally stumble across something surprisingly human. Fantasy lets us ask enormous questions without pretending there will always be neat answers. Sometimes the dragon really does need defeating. Sometimes the dragon has a point. And sometimes the party adopts the dragon, gives it a ridiculous name, and completely destroys the dungeon master's plans for the next 6 sessions. That's about it for today. Let me know in the comments where you stand on morality and fantasy. Do you prefer clearly heroic heroes and truly evil villains? Or do you love those messy situations where everyone has a point and every available decision comes down to at least one deeply uncomfortable consequence? And because tabletop gamers can never resist this question, tell me about the most morally questionable decision your party has ever made while somehow continuing to insist that you were definitely the heroes. I hope you'll be back with us next time. Bye!